Alright, we're back. We're talking some FF7. We're talking some Rebirth, a bit of Part 3 as well. We're talking world map, Chadley a bit, everybody's favorite topic, and of course the Highwind. We're sort of in a similar situation that we've been in like some of the previous videos where I feel like we've discussed some of this shit before, but I don't know that we've discussed all of it. It was courtesy of Shinra Arch, of course, and also the Rebirth Ultimania. And if we had talked about this stuff, it would have been almost a year ago, because the Rebirth Ultimania is almost a year old next month, right? Actually, less than a month from now. So even if it is something we've discussed before, it doesn't hurt to revisit the topic, so let's hop into it. FF7 Rebirth creative director Nomura says they had two issues to overcome in developing the world map. The first was that they needed something that would motivate players to explore the world map, since just moving from destination to destination would feel meaningless. So personally, I gotta disagree a bit with Nomura here, because as somebody whose favorite kind of style of games is open world, especially open world RPGs, I don't really need a reason to explore. You know, having like, you know, world intel shit and stuff like that, it can probably help, I guess, to most players, but at least to me personally, I'm gonna explore anyways. It's what I do with those kinds of games. Like when I think back to like, I don't know, like Fallout 3, the first time I played it, the Bethesda Fallout games, Fallout 4 as well. Like, I was very, very high level, if not max level in Fallout 3 before I ever really progressed the story from just exploring the world map. And with Fallout 4, I think, whenever I first played that game back in 2015, goddamn, that was a long time ago. I think I was like in my 60s before I really started progressing the story. I think before I even went, if you play Fallout 4, before I even went and talked to like Nick Valentine to like progress the story, I think I was in my 60s. This is the kind of player I am when it comes to those kinds of games, right? I'm going to explore your world anyways. I absolutely love exploration. I love environmental storytelling. It's just one of my favorite things. I get distracted. As soon as I have the freedom to explore your world, I'm going to do it. Now, especially given that this is a modern interpretation of Final Fantasy VII, I'm going to explore your world. I don't really need a reason. I don't necessarily want them to get rid of the world intel stuff necessarily. Maybe dial it back a bit. Maybe less attached to Chadley, something along those lines, right? But I don't need a reason to explore your world. I mean, exploring the world doesn't feel meaningless if I don't have like boxes to check necessarily. When it comes to Rebirth, we don't necessarily have an open world, so to speak, right? The regions are very vast, and there's a lot to do and find and things like that, right? But it's not like an open world in the sense that you can just go off in one direction and just keep exploring forever and ever, right? There's a limit to it by the story. You eventually have to move to Junon. You eventually have to take the cargo ship across the water, things like that, right? Maybe things could be different in Part 3. It kind of comes down to how early in the game we get the Highwind, but also how much freedom do we actually have, right? Do we have to go from destination to destination, right? Or can I, you know, kind of play the story sort of like out of sequence? I believe they've actually touched on that before in one interview, not necessarily alluding to the fact that we could do that, but maybe they've thought about that idea. I don't remember exactly. I imagine it would be difficult to tell a cohesive story if we could kind of play it out of sequence, right? But I just wonder, like say we go to Wutai in chapter fucking 8 or something, right? But maybe we get the Highwind in chapter 5, right? Can I still go to Wutai? Can I still visit that location even though we're not there in the story yet? That's something I'm kind of curious about. The continuation of that tweet is, the solution to that came in the form of Hamaguchi's proposal that they center things around Chadley's world incel. The other issue was the problem of the airship. Nomura considers the airship in the third game to be the biggest obstacle in front of them now. So yeah, in order for them to make the world map, I guess, interesting to explore, they came up with the world intel stuff, which we've all talked about at this point for more than a year, right? We all have our opinions on it. It seems like, generally speaking, the majority of people are in agreement that there's just a bit too much Chadley. Some people outright hate the character. I wouldn't say that I hate the character. I think he's a little bit interesting. It's just a bit too much Chadley for me in Rebirth, where he's like always at the forefront of the game if you're doing any kind of side content. I still think that was necessary, right? You don't need to have the side content in the game or the world exploration in the game tied to a particular character. There's countless open world RPGs out there where you just explore the world and there are boxes to check, but you don't hear the voice of one character in your fucking ear the entire time, right? Like, it just wasn't necessary. There's no reason for that. You just want to look at like Ubisoft games, and specifically you could say like Far Cry, since that's kind of what they're mimicking in a way, because you climb radio towers in, you know, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth like you do in the Far Cry series to open up the world map and mark POIs, right? So literally what you do in Far Cry. Like, you have characters that kind of point you in that direction of like, hey, climb this radio tower, do this thing, right? But you're not hearing the same character chirping in your fucking ear the entire time. And that's kind of my biggest issue, I guess, with the world intel shit, is that like pretty much every time you do something world intel related, Chadley like calls in to like say something, even if it's like a very short conversation, you're hearing from him constantly as you're doing everything that there is to do in the game, more or less. And it's like, dude, it's a bit much. Now, conceptually, of course, I do enjoy the world intel stuff. You know, I don't necessarily need that to explore your world map, but you do want things to do. Otherwise, we'd just be running around an open area fighting enemies and there'd be nothing to do, right? So I do like the world intel stuff. Like that there's things to find, monsters to fight, things to discover, whatever, right? That's all great, but some of it can be handled better, right? And I've talked about it in the past, like the summon mini game I'm not a fan of, and just like scanning a fucking crystal, like that's nothing. Like those aren't mini games, those aren't interesting to do. Maybe the fun is in like finding them because they're kind of hidden sometimes, but besides that, they're not really interesting. Also, as I've talked about, you know, countless times in the past, I'd like there to be like actual good items to find in the world. Yeah, there's like the treasure areas that you can go to where you find like 2 or 3 treasure chests or whatever, but they're just like generic items. Like it'd be kind of cool to like find an actual chest that has something useful in it, like a new piece of materia, a new armor, accessory, weapon, something like that. And you guys already know my thoughts on summons. Now the follow-up to the last tweet is, what concerns Nomura most is the logistics of it landing. In order to land a giant airship, you need a wide, flat surface like a runway, but if they approach it like that, then the vehicle will have a lot less freedom in where it touches down. He says it used to be you could just land your little airship icon and things would be fine, but with the graphical scale now more realistic, that's no longer enough. Until that problem is resolved, he thinks flying around in an airship is going to be a real challenge. So this, of course, is another subject we talked about quite a bit over the last year or so, right? Is the logistics of actually landing the airship, which is something I'm not sure how they're going to handle. That's kind of the discussion here, right? Is if they want to make it realistic, we should be able to fly around as much as we want in the world itself, but also land the airship practically anywhere we can. And the thing is, there is like areas, I think, in just about every region we have right now where you could land the airship, but you can't obviously land it literally anywhere. And you couldn't even do that in the original FF7 either. It's limited to specifically like grassy areas, right? Like when it comes to the Icicle Inn area, like there's a little patch of green grass that you have to land the airship on, right? You can't just land it in the snow. Which is why a lot of people do gravitate towards the idea of us rappelling down from the Highwind as opposed to actually landing the big-ass airship somewhere on the ground, right? Which is kind of already a thing that is established when it comes to FF7 anyways. I certainly pointed this out before, I think somewhat recently, but if you go to like the North Crater with the original FF7, we actually climb down like a rope ladder, right? We don't actually land the Highwind down inside the crater, right? Also, if you look at any kind of key art or promotional images for the Highwind, whether that's the original PS1 version or also Rebirth, or actually look at the Highwind in-game, whether that's the PS1 version or Rebirth, it's never actually on the ground. And possibly the most obvious example of the Highwind not actually landing on the ground is the Under the Highwind segment. There's a reason it's called that, right? The Highwind stays floating in the sky. So really when you look at it, it's kind of like long been established that the Highwind doesn't actually land on the ground. You just don't have an animation, of course, on PS1 of us, climbing up and down a rope ladder or some shit outside of the North Crater stuff. And I think that kind of the misconception comes from the animation of landing the Highwind and like getting on and off of it. Like I guess maybe people always assumed, including myself, they're actually like landing it on the ground. So really, if they just stick with like the idea of us rappelling down from the Highwind, you can have the Highwind land anywhere when it comes to the third game, right? You just have to have like a rope or rope ladder or some shit come down from the Highwind and have the Highwind above you wherever you land at, right? That might itself be kind of complicated to do. I don't exactly know, but that's like the best way to do it. The way you can actually land more or less anywhere you want to without actually having to land the physical, gigantic goddamn airship. Obviously, rappelling down from the Highwind offers the best possibilities because if we have to physically land the Highwind somewhere to be able to like land, that limits where you can land it, as Nomura was talking about, right? And also, if we rappel down from the Highwind, that allows us the opportunity to land in like secret locations potentially, right? If we have something we've seen in other Final Fantasies or other RPGs that allow some aspect of flying, that there are locations you can only reach by flying, right? The first one that comes to mind with FF7 would be like the Chocobo Sage's house, and there's maybe some other ones I'm not thinking of outside of glitch stuff. I don't really remember like all this stuff when it comes to 8 and 9, but I know 8 had like the Deep Sea Research Lab that required the Ragnarok, and then 9 had Daguerreo, however you say that shit, like the thief den kind of location that required the airship. When it came to Final Fantasy X, which you couldn't even control or fly around the airship yourself, there was several locations that could only be reached by the Fahrenheit. So regardless of how they implement the Highwind in the next game, hopefully there's several locations that can only be reached by the Highwind. The best way to have those kind of hidden locations is us rappelling down, again, as opposed to landing the gigantic airship. And actually, the conversation of rappelling down from an airship is something we've seen in the franchise before outside the original FF7 with Final Fantasy XII, where you could actually board the straw from this like anchor sort of thing or whatever, which is also the first Final Fantasy that Naoki and Hamaguchi actually worked on. We've actually seen them use aspects of Final Fantasy XII in the remake project with the Gears and Gambits minigame, right, where they actually used the Gambit system. The minigame itself was, it's kind of dick, but at least they tried, the heart was there. I'm a fan of the Gambit system from 12. But I could see them maybe implementing other aspects of 12 into the remake project with potentially the rappelling from the airship. Of course, this is where I pass off to you guys. So what are your thoughts on the world map when it comes to FF7 Rebirth, the world intel stuff, Chadley, the Highwind in the future, the implementation of that, how are they going to allow us to like land essentially? Are we going to be landing the airship? Are we going to be rappelling down? What are your thoughts? I know we've talked about a lot of this shit, pretty much all of this in some way or another the last year or so, but let's talk about it again. Okay, that's the video. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new, search works in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, that's it. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more. And nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine or leave it like Cobain.